It was a perfect day at the park, warm sunlight filtering through the trees, the sound of children laughing, and the smell of fresh grass in the air. Max and I wandered aimlessly, joking about nothing in particular. The world felt safe, like it always did at 10 years old. But then something changed. A strange boy appeared, seemingly out of nowhere. He didn't ask to join us, he simply did. At first, he seemed normal, even friendly, but there was something off. I couldn't quite place it then, but a quiet unease crept in, like the air itself had grown colder. The boy walked with us, his presence unnervingly quiet at first. He didn't introduce himself or explain why he'd joined, but he talked. Little things, small talk, nothing that stood out. Yet something about him felt wrong. Then, without warning, his laughter erupted. It wasn't joyful or playful, it was loud, wild, unhinged, like it didn't belong to a child. Max and I exchanged uneasy glances, forcing smiles. "We have to go," I lied, trying to sound casual. But he didn't stop. He just laughed harder. The sound echoed around us, cutting through the once peaceful park like a blade through silence. We turned and walked quickly, pretending his laughter wasn't clawing at our nerves. The boy's voice carried behind us, manic giggles filling the air, growing louder with every step. I whispered to Max, "Don't look back. Just keep walking." My heart pounded as if it knew something I didn't, but the boy wasn't done. The laughter followed us, closer now. I could hear the rhythm of his feet hitting the ground. He wasn't just walking anymore. He was following us. My chest tightened, and I glanced back despite myself. He was right there, just a few feet away, grinning ear to ear, his eyes wide with something far from joy. "Run!" I gasped, grabbing Max's arm. We broke into a sprint, weaving through the park's winding paths. Trees blurred past us, the playground equipment twisted into strange shapes in my peripheral vision. My breaths came in short bursts, adrenaline fueling my legs as we raced toward safety. I could hear Max breathing heavily beside me, his face pale and focused. Behind us, the laughter turned guttural, almost animalistic. I didn't dare look back again. Every time I heard his footfalls, they seemed closer, louder, more frantic. I didn't know how he kept up, but I could feel his presence, like a shadow breathing down my neck. We darted past a bench, almost colliding with an elderly man who shouted after us. We didn't stop. My focus was on one thing, the distant shape of our parents standing near the parking lot. The boy's footsteps were still there, relentless, pounding like a second heartbeat in my ears. "Almost there," I whispered, though my voice barely came out. The world around us seemed to narrow, the park fading into a tunnel vision of escape. My legs burned, but I couldn't stop, not when I could still hear him behind us. As we reached the edge of the park, I finally dared to look back. The boy had stopped. He stood at the edge of the trees, his grin somehow wider, more menacing. His laughter had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. His head tilted slightly like he was studying us, memorizing our faces. We stumbled toward our parents, gasping for breath. They turned to us, concern etched on their faces, but we didn't know how to explain. "Just a weird kid," Max muttered quickly, and I nodded. My mom frowned, glancing back toward the park, but the boy was gone, as if he'd never been there. Max and I exchanged a glance, unspoken fear passing between us. We didn't tell them everything. How could we? How could we describe the way his laughter felt like it had burrowed into our skin? Or the way his eyes seemed to see something beyond us, something darker? That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake his face from my mind. His grin, stretched far beyond anything human, haunted me. Somewhere in the back of my mind, I knew this wasn't over. The next day, the memory of the strange boy lingered like a bad dream. Max and I hadn't spoken about it, but his face, the way his grin seemed to twist unnaturally, the sound of that laughter, stayed with me. I tried to convince myself it was over. He was just some weird kid from the park, nothing more. But deep down I knew that wasn't true. Later that afternoon, we found ourselves back at the park. Max and I both agreed to stick close to our parents, their calm presence a comfort. For a while, everything seemed normal. The sun was shining, kids were playing, and the park felt alive again. I almost believed the boy wouldn't come back, Almost. He wasn't far, standing under the shade of a large oak tree. His posture was stiff, his head tilted slightly as if he were trying to decide something. For a moment I thought I was imagining it, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But when I nudged Max and pointed, he froze. He saw him too. The boy stepped out of the shadows. His movements were slow, deliberate. He didn't say a word, but his presence screamed menace. His eyes locked onto ours, and my stomach churned. That same wide, grotesque smile stretched across his face, but now it felt more sinister, almost mocking. We edged closer to our parents, trying to act normal. My mom noticed something was wrong. "Everything okay?" she asked, her brow furrowed with concern. I forced a smile and nodded. "Yeah, just tired," but the boy didn't stop. He kept walking toward us, his footsteps slow and deliberate. I couldn't take my eyes off him. There was something in the way he moved, controlled, almost calculated. It was as if he was daring us to react, to acknowledge the threat that only Max and I seemed to see. When he reached us, he finally stopped. His grin remained plastered on his face, but his eyes burned with something colder, something darker. My mom, oblivious to the tension, asked, "Are you looking for someone, sweetie?" The boy didn't answer. He just stood there staring at us. Then, slowly, his grin began to fade, replaced by a scowl so sharp it felt like a knife in my chest. His face twisted with rage for a brief moment, and then it shifted again. Back into that unnatural smile, I stepped back instinctively, and Max grabbed my arm. "Let's go," he muttered under his breath. The boy's mother appeared suddenly, calling his name from a distance. He didn't react immediately, just continued to stare at us. Finally, he turned and walked away, but not before casting one last glance over his shoulder. His smile, now barely visible, felt like a promise that he wasn't done with us yet. That was the moment I knew. This wasn't just some strange kid. This was something far worse. I thought the park would be the last time I'd see him. I convinced myself it was over, that the boy was just a strange memory fading into the background of life. But I was wrong. A few weeks later, I noticed something chilling. His face. It wasn't in person, not yet. It was in my mind, in my dreams. Every night I'd close my eyes and see him, standing just far enough away to make me uneasy. That wide, unnatural grin stretched across his face, those hollow, dark eyes boring into me. He didn't move, he didn't speak, he just stared. Then Max texted me, "Dude, remember that kid? Turns out he lives in my apartment." My stomach dropped. I wanted to believe it was a coincidence, that it didn't matter. But something about that text felt like a warning. Max wasn't scared. He laughed it off, calling the kid weird but harmless. I couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't just weird. Days later, the "for sale" sign appeared in my neighbor's yard. At first, I didn't connect the two. Why would I? But then, on a quiet afternoon, a moving truck pulled up. I watched from my window as a car followed behind, and out stepped him. The boy. My heart stopped. He didn't look around or smile politely like the rest of his family. He just stood there staring at my house, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, his lips curled into that grotesque, unnatural grin I would never forget. It felt personal, intentional, like he had followed me here on purpose. And in that moment I knew the nightmare wasn't over. It was only beginning. It was late at night, a few weeks after the boy moved in next door. I hadn't seen much of him since, and I was grateful for the silence. I told myself that maybe I had overreacted, that he was just a weird kid who liked to play pranks. But deep down, I knew better. Then the first message came. My phone buzzed, breaking the stillness of the night. I reached for it groggily, expecting some random notification. Instead, it was a text from an unknown number. My heart skipped a beat. I stared at the words, their simplicity somehow more terrifying than if they'd been longer. I tried to laugh it off, convincing myself it was a prank. Maybe Tyler, my friend from school, had gotten hold of a new number. He was always pulling stunts like this, but before I could reply, another message buzzed in. This time it was Max. For the rest of the night, sleep eluded me. Every creak of the house, every rustle of leaves outside my window felt like him. I stayed up, watching the shadows stretch and twist across my walls until exhaustion finally dragged me under. I woke with a start at exactly 12 a.m., my body frozen in place. I couldn't shake the sensation that I wasn't alone. My room, bathed in faint moonlight, seemed too quiet, too still. The boy stood at the foot of my bed, his face partially obscured by the shadows. But his eyes, they glinted like knives in the darkness. In his hand, he held something that caught the faint light. A knife. Panic surged through me, but my body wouldn't move. He stepped closer, silent as a ghost, his face contorted into that same grotesque smile. It wasn't the grin of a child. It was something inhuman, a deliberate mockery of innocence. My instincts finally kicked in. I threw myself off the bed, narrowly avoiding the glinting blade as he lunged. My mind raced. I had to get him out of the house, away from my family. I bolted out of the room, my feet barely touching the ground as I ran through the darkened halls. Behind me, his footsteps were heavy and fast, a predator closing in on prey. I flung open the front door and sprinted into the street, hoping to lure him away. But he was faster. He tackled me to the ground, and before I could react, the world went black. When I woke, I was somewhere new, somewhere worse. And that was when the true nightmare began. I woke to the sound of dripping water and the oppressive weight of cold, damp air pressing down on me. My head throbbed, and my vision blurred as I tried to make sense of where I was. The smell hit me first, a sickening mix of decay and mildew. Slowly, the room came into focus and my stomach turned. I was in a basement. The walls were made of cracked concrete, and the faint glow of a single bulb barely lit the space. Chains rattled somewhere in the darkness, and then I saw them. Cages. Lining the far wall were rusted, filthy cages, and inside them were kids. Some were crying softly, others sat motionless, their eyes hollow, as if they'd already given up. My breath hitched when I spotted Max in one of the cages. His face was pale, his strong frame hunched over. He looked up and locked eyes with me, his expression a mix of terror and desperation. He sat in a chair near the center of the room, completely calm, like a king surveying his domain. His face was illuminated by the dim light, and that grin, oh, that grin, was still there, as unnatural and horrifying as ever. His eyes moved slowly across the room, drinking in the fear like it was fuel. On the wall behind him, photos were pinned in neat rows. My heart stopped when I realized they were pictures of me. At school, at the park, even through my bedroom window. Each one was more invasive than the last, and they were all recent. The boy didn't speak. He didn't need to. He stood moving with an eerie, deliberate slowness and walked to one of the cages. The child inside whimpered, shrinking back as far as the small space would allow. Without hesitation, the boy unlocked the cage and dragged the kid out. The boy's movements were methodical, almost surgical. He began torturing the child, carving into him piece by piece with a precision that made my stomach churn. The child's screams filled the room, piercing and raw, echoing off the walls like a symphony of terror. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. My body was frozen, paralyzed by the sheer horror of what I was witnessing. When he was done, the boy turned toward Max's cage. His grin widened and he stepped closer, knife in hand. My mind screamed at me to move, to do something, anything. Desperation fueled me, and I hurled myself against the flimsy wall of my cage. It tipped over, slamming into the ground with a deafening crash. The key to the locks fell loose and I scrambled to grab it. My hands shook as I fumbled with the lock, but finally, I broke free. Before the boy could react, I lunged for him. My hand closed around the knife and I drove it into his arm. He shrieked, the first sound I'd ever heard him make that wasn't laughter. Adrenaline surged as I unlocked Max's cage and the others. "Run!" I shouted. But even as we fled, I knew this wasn't over. The boy wasn't human and he wasn't done with me. The night air was cold as we burst out of the basement, gasping for breath and covered in sweat and grime. The kids scattered, running as far and fast as their legs could take them. Max stayed close to me, his face pale but determined. For a brief moment I thought we were safe, but then I felt it, a sharp, searing pain in my back. I stumbled forward, barely catching myself. When I turned, there he was, the boy. Blood dripped from his arm where I'd stabbed him earlier. but his grin was as wide and sinister as ever. In his other hand, he clutched another knife. "You're not getting away." His voice rasped low and cold, the first words I'd ever heard him speak. "Run, Max!" I shouted, pushing him toward the house. "Get inside and lock the doors." Max hesitated for a second, but the fear in my eyes must have convinced him. He bolted toward safety and I was left alone, face to face with the boy. My body trembled, but I couldn't let him win. Not after everything I'd seen, everything he'd done. He lunged at me, the knife glinting under the moonlight. I dodged, adrenaline dulling the pain in my back. I had no weapon, no plan, just raw instinct. I grabbed a rock from the ground and hurled it at him. It hit his shoulder, making him stumble, but he recovered quickly, his grin twisting into a snarl. "You think you can stop me?" he hissed, advancing again. I backed up, searching for anything I could use. My hand brushed against something cold and sharp, a broken metal pipe lying in the dirt. Without thinking, I grabbed it and held it in front of me like a sword. The boy circled me, his movements deliberate and calculating. His laughter returned, low and guttural, echoing in the still night. Then he attacked. Our clash was brutal. He was fast, faster than any normal kid should have been, but I was fueled by desperation. He slashed at me, his blade grazing my arm, but I swung the pipe and hit his ribs. He let out a guttural growl and lunged again. We fought like animals, neither of us holding back. My vision blurred with pain and exhaustion, but I couldn't stop. He was relentless, but I was determined. Finally, I saw my chance. As he raised his knife for a final strike, I drove the pipe into his stomach with all my strength. He staggered back, his eyes wide with shock. For a moment, he seemed almost human. Then his grin returned, weaker now, but still horrifying. "This isn't over," he whispered before collapsing to the ground. I dropped the pipe, my hands trembling as the weight of what had just happened settled over me. The boy lay still, his twisted smile finally fading. Sirens wailed in the distance. I turned toward the house where Max and the other kids were safe. The nightmare was over, or so I thought. Even now, I wonder if he'll come back. Something about him wasn't human, and some horrors refused to stay buried. The sirens grew louder, piercing through the stillness of the night. I stumbled toward the house, each step a struggle as the adrenaline faded and the pain in my body became impossible to ignore. The front door burst open, and Max rushed out, followed by a group of trembling kids. Relief washed over me when I saw they were unharmed. "You're bleeding!" Max shouted, his voice cracking with panic. "I'm fine," I lied, leaning against the doorway for support. My eyes darted back toward the yard where the boy's lifeless body lay crumpled on the ground. I expected to feel triumph, even closure, but all I felt was an unsettling emptiness. The police arrived moments later, their flashing lights casting eerie shadows across the scene. I tried to explain what had happened, but the words felt hollow. How could I describe the boy, his inhuman strength, his twisted grin, and the horrors we had endured? Would they even believe me? The officers found the basement, the cages, and the grim evidence of what had taken place. They escorted the orphans to safety, their small, frightened faces etched with a mix of relief and lingering fear. Max clung to my side, silent and pale, as if he too couldn't find the words to process it all. When they examined the boy's body, something strange happened. One of the officers turned to me, his expression unreadable. "You said you fought him here, right?" I nodded, confusion creeping in. "Then why isn't there any blood?" My heart skipped a beat. I stumbled toward the spot where the boy had fallen. The ground was empty, no body, no blood, just the faint imprint of where he'd been. "He was right there," I whispered, panic rising in my chest. "I stabbed him. I killed him." The officer exchanged a look with his partner, their skepticism palpable. "We'll file a report, but..." His voice trailed off, leaving the implication hanging in the air. I glanced at Max, his face as pale as mine. He saw it too, he knew. The boy was real, but now he was gone, as if he had simply vanished into the night. Even now I don't know what he was. Human, monster, or something else entirely. But sometimes late at night I feel eyes watching me from the shadows. And when I close my eyes, I still see his smile. This nightmare isn't over. It never will be. Weeks have passed since that night, but the memories remain as vivid as ever, etched into my mind like scars that refuse to heal. Max and I don't talk about it, not directly. There's an unspoken agreement between us, a shared understanding that putting the horror into words might make it real again. The other kids were placed in foster homes, their young lives forever changed by what they endured. I keep thinking about their faces, the hollow stares of kids who saw too much. Sometimes I wonder if they see him too, in their dreams, in the shadows of their new homes. As for the boy, the authorities labeled the case as inconclusive. No body, no solid evidence of what truly happened. The basement was real, the cages were real. But the boy? To them, he was just a ghost story, something conjured by fear and trauma. But I know better. Late at night, when the house is quiet and the world outside feels unnervingly still, I can feel it. A presence. Watching. Waiting. I see movement in the corner of my eye, but when I turn, nothing's there. I hear faint laughter sometimes, echoing just at the edge of perception. Low and guttural, just like his. And then there are the dreams. In them, he stands in the distance, his grin wider than ever, his eyes unblinking. He doesn't move, doesn't speak. He just watches, as if waiting for the perfect moment to return. I try to tell myself it's over, that I stopped him, that he's gone for good. But deep down, I know the truth. Some things don't die. Some things stay with you, no matter how far you run. And one day, I know he'll come back. Life has tried to move forward, but the shadow of that night clings to me like a second skin. Every routine feels tainted by the lingering fear. I don't let myself be alone anymore. Not at home, not at school, not anywhere. Max checks in on me daily, and we've become closer than ever, bonded by a shared nightmare. But something isn't right. It started with small things. My window unlocked when I knew I had bolted it. Scratches on the wooden frame that weren't there before. I brushed them off, tried to convince myself they were nothing. But then the messages came again. The first was scrawled on the bathroom mirror, faint and foggy. "You thought it was over." My heart sank as I stared at the words, written in the condensation after a hot shower. My parents didn't believe me when I told them. They said I was under stress, that I needed rest. The second message was louder, more direct. A piece of paper slid under my door late at night read, "I'm watching you." My blood ran cold as I scanned the darkness outside, but no one was there. Then came the nightmare that didn't feel like a dream. I woke up in the middle of the night to the feeling of being watched. There, standing in the corner of my room, was a shadowy figure. I froze, too scared to move, too terrified to even breathe. His grin gleamed in the moonlight, and though he didn't move, his presence was suffocating. When I blinked, he was gone. But the sense of dread stayed, gnawing at the edges of my sanity. He's not finished. I don't know when, but he'll come for me again. And this time, I might not survive. The night was quiet. Far too quiet. Even the usual hum of crickets and the rustle of leaves seemed absent, as if the world itself was holding its breath. I sat in my room, every nerve on edge. The messages, the shadows, the laughter. Everything had been building to this moment, and deep down, I knew he was coming. It started with a faint tapping sound. At first, I thought it was the wind, but it was too deliberate, too rhythmic. Tap, tap, tap. My eyes darted to the window. The curtains fluttered lightly, but the glass was fogged, obscuring my view. Then came the laughter. It was quiet at first, like a whisper carried on the wind, but it grew louder, more distinct, more twisted. My heart raced as I stepped toward the window, my legs trembling beneath me. Slowly, I pulled back the curtain. There he was, standing just outside, his face pressed against the glass, was the boy. His grin was even wider now, his eyes burning with a malevolent glee. His hand tapped the window in a slow, taunting rhythm, as if daring me to react. I stumbled back, my breath hitching in my throat. My phone was on the desk. I lunged for it, dialing Max's number with shaking hands. The call went straight to voicemail. "Why won't you leave me alone?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. As if in response, the boy raised one hand and placed a finger to his lips, mimicking a silent shush. Then, with a sudden burst of strength, he slammed his hand against the glass, cracking it. I screamed, backing into the corner of my room as the crack spidered outward. He was coming inside. The window shattered with a deafening crash, glass spraying across the room like shards of ice. I scrambled backward, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The boy climbed through the opening with an unnatural grace, his movements eerily fluid, like a predator closing in on its prey. His grin hadn't wavered, wide and grotesque, cutting through the darkness like a blade. He stood there for a moment, head tilted, as if savoring my fear. Then he stepped closer. I grabbed the nearest thing I could, a lamp from my bedside table, and hurled it at him. It struck his shoulder, but he didn't flinch. He just kept coming, the glint of a knife catching the faint moonlight filtering through the broken window. "Why are you doing this?" I shouted, my voice cracking as I pressed myself against the far wall. His response was chilling, a low guttural laugh that filled the room, drowning out my panicked breaths. He didn't need to speak. His intentions were written in the darkness of his eyes, in the unrelenting curve of his smile. I lunged for the door, my only hope of escape, but he was faster. In an instant he was there, slamming it shut with a force that rattled the walls. I stumbled back, my legs barely supporting me. The knife gleamed in his hand as he raised it, stepping closer, the air between us thick with menace. My mind raced, searching for anything, a weapon, a way out, a miracle. And then I saw it, the jagged shard of glass from the window lying just within reach. Summoning every ounce of courage, I dove for it, my fingers closing around its sharp edge even as it cut into my skin. This wasn't over, not yet.